Have you ever wondered what truly causes a narcissist to lose control is not simply that you left, but that you left and no longer needed them? No more long messages explaining yourself, no more trying to prove your worth, no more reacting to their familiar manipulations. What remains is a version of you that is quiet, clear, and fully in control of yourself. And it is precisely in that moment, when you stop seeking validation from them, when your emotions are no longer pulled by their words or actions, that the entire power they once believed they held begins to collapse. Because the truth is, a narcissist does not live on love. They live on control. And when you are no longer within that field of control, you don't just leave them. You dismantle the entire system they built to keep you there. They won't say it out loud, but you will see it in their eyes, in their reactions, in the growing instability that begins to surface. Because for the first time, they are facing something they cannot manipulate, a person who has awakened. And when that happens, you don't need to do anything else. Everything speaks for itself. 1. When you stop reacting, power begins to shift. When you stop reacting, what changes is not the surface of the relationship, but the underlying power structure beneath it, which begins to shift quietly, yet irreversibly. In the past, every time you explained yourself, every time you got angry, every time you tried to clarify right and wrong, you believed you were protecting yourself. But in reality, you were unintentionally participating in a mechanism where your emotions became the fuel that allowed the other person to maintain control. A narcissist does not need you to love them in a healthy way. They need you to react, because your reaction proves they still have influence. But when you stop, not because you lost, but because you understood the entire system loses its core function. Your silence is not emptiness. It is a boundary. It is not avoidance, but a conscious decision that you will no longer allow anyone access to your emotional space if they do not respect it. What makes this shift powerful is not what you say, but the fact that you no longer feel the need to say anything at all. You no longer feel compelled to prove that you are right, nor are you pulled into the need to be understood by someone who is either incapable of understanding or unwilling to do so. And it is at this point that power begins to leave their hands, because their power was never real. It only existed as long as you continued to participate in the game they created. When you step out quietly, without declarations, without retaliation, you are not just rejecting them, you are rejecting the role you were once forced to play. This creates a disruption they cannot process in familiar ways, because all of their strategies rely on prediction. They know how you will react, how you will hurt, when you will return. But once you become unpredictable, no longer triggered, they lose their ability to navigate the situation. At a deeper level, this forces them to face a void they once filled by controlling others, their own inner emptiness. You may not immediately see the change in them, but you will clearly feel the change within yourself, a calm that is no longer tense, a clarity that is no longer clouded by doubt, and a sense of self-possession that no longer depends on anyone else. This is not a loud victory, but an inner restructuring where you are no longer driven by the very things that once disoriented you. And when you stand firmly in that state, you will understand something simple yet profound. The person who once controlled you was never as powerful as you believed. They were only powerful when you had not yet recognized your own strength. 2. They didn't lose you, they lost control over you. What you need to face, though it may not be easy to accept at first, is that they never truly lost you in the sense of a deep emotional loss. What they actually lost is the ability to shape you, influence you, and make you operate according to their expectations. In a healthy relationship, two people connect through understanding and respect. But in a control-based relationship, the bond is not built on emotion, it is built on power. And that power is constructed very subtly, little by little, making you doubt yourself, little by little, making you feel that you need them to feel stable, to be validated, to feel enough. When you are in that state, you are not just present in their life, you become part of the system that sustains their sense of self. But the moment you step out of that system, no longer reacting the way you used to, no longer seeking validation from them, what they lose is not you as an independent person, but the version of you they once had control over. And that is why their reaction often does not resemble someone grieving the loss of a relationship, but rather someone panicking over the loss of power. You will see it in the way they try to pull you back, not through genuine change, but through familiar tactics, revisiting shared memories, inducing guilt, or even presenting a better version of themselves, just to test whether they still have an effect on you. But if you observe closely enough, you will realize that none of this comes from a desire to reconnect it, comes from the fear of losing control, because in their world, control equals safety. And when you are no longer within that range, they are forced to face a reality they are not used to. A person who cannot be defined, cannot be controlled, and no longer plays a role in reinforcing their sense of worth. What matters is that you understand this shift does not come from them becoming weaker. It comes from you no longer giving them power the way you once did. That power was never truly theirs. It only existed within the space you allowed. And when you withdraw that permission without announcement, without confrontation, you do something not everyone is conscious enough to do. You separate yourself from an unhealthy structure you once believed was love. From there, you begin to see everything more clearly, not with resentment, but with the understanding that you have lost nothing. The only thing that disappeared was the illusion that they ever had control over you. 2-3. Your calm becomes the most powerful psychological blow. Your calm, when seen from the outside, may appear passive, as if you no longer care, no longer feel, no longer want to be involved. But at a deeper level, it is one of the strongest expressions of inner mastery, and for that very reason, it becomes the kind of psychological impact a narcissist finds hardest to tackle. Because they do not operate in a world of genuine connection. They operate within a system that depends on reaction. They need to see you angry, to feel powerful, to see you hurt, to know they still have influence, to see you explain yourself, to maintain their position of control. But when you no longer respond according to those scripts, when you are no longer triggered by the words or behaviors that once unsettled you, you do more than change how you deal with them. You render their entire way of reading you meaningless. This shift does not happen in a single moment. It is the result of a process in which you gradually realize that not every word requires a response, not every provocation deserves a reaction, and not every relationship is worthy of your energy. The calm here is not emotional suppression. It is the ability to choose not to let your emotions be controlled by unhealthy external forces. And that choice creates a distance they cannot cross, because they no longer have a foothold to manipulate. They may try to repeat old tactics, escalate their behavior, or reach for the same triggers that once worked. But if you remain consistent in your calm, you will begin to see that all those efforts become fragmented, ineffective, and ultimately reveal their own powerlessness. What makes this profound is not what you do to them, but the fact that you no longer allow them to determine your inner state. You do not need to prove that you are strong. Your calm is the proof. And while they try to understand why you no longer react as before, you have already moved into a different phase 1 where you are no longer bound by the need to be seen or validated by them. In that space, you are not cold, you are clear. It is not that you no longer feel, it is that you no longer give power to emotions triggered by manipulation. And that clarity creates a kind of psychological pressure they cannot control, because for the first time, they are facing someone who is no longer an environment to be exploited, but an independent, self-possessed individual who is no longer willing to participate in the game at all. 4. They begin to panic, but never admit it. When you no longer react, no longer return, no longer get pulled back into old cycles, something begins to happen within them, not acceptance, but a quiet panic. And the crucial point is this: they will never admit it directly, because for a narcissist, admitting a loss of control means facing a truth they have spent their entire life avoiding, that their power was never as solid as they believed. Instead of saying, "I'm losing you," They will translate that feeling into familiar behaviors: sarcasm, devaluation, emotional coldness, or even projecting the image that they are doing better than ever. But if you are aware enough to observe, you will notice that these expressions are inconsistent, unstable, and often reactive rather than intentional. These are signs of an internal system falling out of balance. They may try to recreate the old script texting as if nothing happened, bringing up shared memories, or creating situations that provoke a response from you. But each of these is a test. Do they still have control over you? And when you don't respond the way they expect, that panic does not disappear, it simply shifts into other forms, more subtle, harder to detect, but also more unstable. What reveals this process is not what they say, but the misalignment between their words and their actions. A person who is truly stable does not need to prove that they are okay, but someone who is losing control will constantly try to project the image of control. And it is at this point that you begin to see a truth that was once hidden by your own emotions. They were never as strong as you thought. They were simply accustomed to you being less grounded than you are now. When you change, they cannot adapt, and instead of evolving, they try to pull you back to your previous state in order to restore their familiar sense of control. But if you remain steady in your state, you will notice a paradox. The less you react, the more their instability becomes visible. The more distance you maintain, the more you realize that they depended on you far more than you ever depended on them. And on a deeper level, this is not only about them, it is also about you. It means you have stepped out of a role you once believed you could not escape, and that very growth renders all previous attempts at control ineffective. They may never say they are panicking, but you don't need them to. Because when someone loses what they once controlled and has no replacement for it, their silence is no longer calm. It is the sign of an internal structure quietly beginning to fracture. 5. When you grow, their true nature is revealed. When you begin to grow not in terms of age, but in awareness and inner development, something very natural happens. What was once hidden gradually becomes visible, including the true nature of the person you once could not clearly see. In the phase when you were still caught in emotions, occupied with explaining, proving, enduring, or hoping they would change, you did not have enough distance to observe objectively. But when you step back, when you no longer react out of old patterns, you begin to see everything with a clarity that almost feels cold, not because you have become emotionless, but because you are no longer influenced by illusion. And in that state, behaviors that once confused you become surprisingly easy to understand. The contradictions in what they say, the sudden shifts in attitude, the ways they twist narratives to always appear right. None of these are isolated incidents anymore, but reveal themselves as a consistent pattern. What matters is that you do not need to expose them, nor do you need to argue to prove anything. Because when you change how you live and how you respond, the truth reveals itself. What they once said about you begins to lose its weight when it is no longer reinforced by your behavior. Meanwhile, what they display becomes increasingly clear to those around them, especially when you are no longer there to absorb, soften, or shield their contradictions. And here lies a paradox many people fail to see. It is not what you do that exposes them, but the fact that you stop doing what you used to do, stop tolerating, stop explaining, stop cooperating in unhealthy dynamics that causes the facade they built to lose its support. When there is no longer anyone reflecting back the image they want to see, they are forced to face themselves, or at least allow others to see what they once concealed. For you, this is not a confrontational victory, but a shift in perception. You no longer need to prove that they are wrong, because you no longer need them to be right. You are no longer bound by the story they once imposed on you, and therefore, you no longer play a role in maintaining that story. When you stand firmly in your growth, you will realize that what matters is not how they are exposed, but that you have finally seen clearly, and once you have seen clearly, you cannot return to not knowing. 6. You no longer need them to understand you. That is the greatest turning point. The most profound transformation in your entire journey is not the moment you left, nor the moment you began to live better. It is the moment you truly let go of the need to be understood by them. It sounds simple, but in reality, it is a fundamental shift in how you see yourself and your relationships. In the past, you may have spent a great deal of time explaining, clarifying, trying to make them see your perspective, not because you were weak, but because you believed that understanding was the foundation of connection. But over time, you begin to realize something not everyone is aware enough to accept. Not everyone listens to understand. Some people listen to argue, to control, or to maintain their position in a narrative they have already written. And when you keep explaining in a space like that, you are not moving closer to understanding. You are simply draining your energy in a loop with no end. That is why, when you stop no longer trying to make them understand you, no longer seeking validation from them, you do more than change how you communicate. You completely shift your position within that relationship. You are no longer in the position of someone who needs to be validated, but become someone who defines their own value. And this has a very clear consequence. You become unmanipulable in the old way, because most control tactics rely on making you feel that you need to explain, need to prove, need to fix something in order to be accepted. When that need is gone, those tactics lose their effectiveness naturally. You don't have to resist or fight them. What makes this turning point powerful is that it does not depend on whether the other person changes or not. It lies entirely within your control. You do not need them to understand you in order to know that you are right, and you do not need their validation to feel that you have value. And when you truly live with that awareness, you experience a very specific kind of freedom, not freedom from a particular person, but freedom from the need to be defined by others. From that point on, every interaction becomes clearer, simpler, and less draining. You are no longer pulled into meaningless conversations, no longer dragged into arguments that lead nowhere, because you have realized that your peace does not depend on whether someone else understands you. And when you stand firmly in that state, you will see that what once hurt you the most, the feeling of not being understood, no longer has any power over you, because you have become someone who understands yourself deeply enough that you no longer need to seek it from a place that could never truly provide it. 7. You become something they can no longer reach. There comes a stage where you no longer have to actively avoid them because you have become a version of yourself they can no longer reach, not in physical distance, but in your inner state. In the past, they could access you through your emotions. A word could hurt you. An action could make you doubt yourself. A silence could pull you into anxiety and a search for answers. But when you change, when you no longer react in familiar ways, when you no longer allow them to shape your emotions or thoughts, you no longer need to build defenses to protect yourself. You have become a space they cannot enter. This does not come from becoming cold or distant, but from understanding your boundaries and no longer allowing anyone to cross them simply because you were once used to accepting it. And this is what confuses them the most. They can still see you, still know you exist, may even see you doing better, but they can no longer reach you in the way they once did. The methods they once used to influence you, from sweet words to punishing silence, no longer work. Not because they have changed their tactics, but because you are no longer the same person those tactics could affect. You are no longer the version of yourself that needed their attention to feel worthy, no longer someone pulled into the emotional loops they created, and no longer someone who would return out of familiarity or nostalgia. This creates a very particular kind of distance, not the distance of disconnection, but the distance of growth. You understand them, but you are no longer bound to them. You see clearly what is happening, but you no longer feel the need to intervene or change it. And it is precisely this separation that makes you out of reach in a way they cannot process. Because in their world, everything requires a point of attachment, an emotion, a reaction, some form of connection they can manipulate. But when you no longer provide any point of contact, they no longer know how to approach you. What matters is that you recognize this state is not the result of resisting them, but of returning to yourself. You do not need to prove that you are stronger than they are. You simply no longer depend on them to feel that you are enough. And when you live from that place, you will see that this unreachability is not a strategy. It is the natural outcome of changing how you exist. You are no longer operating in the same psychological space as they are. And therefore, no matter how much they try, they cannot access you in the old way. And that is when you understand something essential. True freedom is not escaping someone, it is becoming someone they no longer have the power to reach. 8. The real victory. You no longer want to win against them. The real victory does not come in the moment they realize their mistakes, nor when they come back to apologize, nor when you prove that you were right, because all of those things, however satisfying they may seem, still keep you within the same frame of reference as them. The true victory arrives in a much quieter moment, when you no longer feel the need to win against them at all. That is when you realize that the entire conflict you once experienced only existed within a space. They created a space where everything is measured by right and wrong, winning and losing, control and reaction. And when you stop playing by those rules, the game ends on its own without anyone needing to declare it. In the past, you may have imagined an ending where they finally recognize your worth, where they regret what they did, where justice is served in a way you can clearly see. But over time, you begin to understand that if you still need those things to feel at peace, then at some level, you are still tied to them. And this realization becomes the greatest turning point. You begin to separate your value from how they perceive you, and you no longer place your peace in whether they change or not. This does not mean you deny what happened, nor that you become numb to your own pain. On the contrary, you face it directly, but you no longer allow it to define your future. You understand that winning against someone always requires you to participate in their game, while living a better life requires no participation from them at all. And when you choose a second path, you do more than leave them, you leave behind the need to prove anything to them. This creates a very different kind of freedom. You are no longer triggered by what they say, no longer pulled into thoughts about what they are doing, thinking, or whether they regret anything. You simply continue your life building, growing, and finding meaning in places that have nothing to do with them. And the paradox is this. It is precisely this state, where you no longer care about winning or losing, that makes them feel the greatest loss of control. Because while they are still trying to define themselves in relation to you, you are no longer there, at least not in the way they understand. You are no longer an opponent, no longer someone they need to defeat or keep. You become part of a past they can no longer manipulate. And when you look back from that place, you will see clearly. Victory is not making them lose. It is no longer needing the battle in the first place. After everything, what remains is not the story of what a narcissist did to you, but the journey of what you did with yourself after you walked away from it. Because if you look closely, every meaningful shift did not happen in them, it happened within you. From someone who constantly reacted, you became someone who chooses. From someone who needed to be understood, you became someone who understands yourself. From someone pulled into emotional cycles, you became someone who stands outside and observes with clarity. And those changes that seem quiet are actually the most powerful, because they do not require external validation to exist. You're no longer defined by how they see you, no longer held back by unanswered questions, and no longer bound by the need to prove that you are worthy. Instead, you begin to live by a simple yet difficult principle. You do not give control over your inner world to those who do not respect it. This does not make you cold. On the contrary, it makes you clearer about where you invest your energy, in whom, and why. You no longer need to win against anyone, because you have stepped out of a game whose nature was never healthy to begin with. And once you are no longer in that game, the very concepts of winning and losing lose their meaning. What you gain is not victory over someone else, but self-mastery, a state where you do not need to control others to feel safe, nor do you need to react to prove that you exist. They may never understand this, and they may continue living within their familiar cycles, but that no longer concerns you. Because at this point you are no longer in the same space as they are, even if physically you may still exist somewhere nearby. You have moved into a different level of awareness, where calm is not the absence of problems, but the result of no longer allowing old problems to control you. And if there is only one thing to remember, it is this. You do not need a perfect ending from them to begin a complete life for yourself. You already have everything you need from the moment you decided not to return to what once made you lose yourself.